because the McMichaels were certainly capable of catching up with him and shooting him if that was their intention. One more proximate cause issue I want to discuss on these 4 felony murder counts, because it's basically the same issue. And the issue, the principle is one of intervening acts. The judge is going to instruct you that the causation must be direct and it must be substantial. And although the charge doesn't use the words, essentially it must be unbroken. Anything that breaks the chain of causation prevents a return of a verdict on felony murder.
Objection. Obviously, there's an issue. That is.
Mr. Goff, if we could please, if you were going to make representation with regard to the law that will be charged to the jury,
yes,
if we could remain within the charge that has already been approved by the court and that will be read by the court.
Let me, thank you, Your Honor. Let me go back and make sure I haven't misspoken. The court is going to charge you, I believe, that the felony must have directly caused the death or played a substantial and necessary part in causing the death. In this case, what I'm suggesting to you is that if either the actions of Mr. Arbery or the actions of Travis McMichael or the actions of both contributed to Mr. Arbery's death, then Mr. Bryan cannot be the direct, the substantial, and the necessary cause of that death. What am I talking about? I think it's already been referenced. I could be wrong. I don't want to misspeak. That that Ahmaud Arbery turns in front of the vehicle at the white pickup truck at the last moment and basically meets Travis McMichael in the front of the truck. We can't see in front of the truck, but we know that's where they are. The question for you is, and I'm not trying to decipher who did what or why, because from Mr. Bryan's perspective, it doesn't matter. It does for yours, but from Mr. Bryan's perspective, it doesn't matter. But Mr. Arbery's decision at that last moment to turn left instead of right, as Mr. Bryan would have expected, as you can tell from the way he's angling his phone, anticipating Mr. Arbery's path of travel, when Mr. Arbery turns to the left, does that not break the causal chain in this case? I would submit that it does. Whether Mr. Arbery is justified in turning and coming at Mr. McMichael or not, that's for you to decide. That affects other people in this case. But Mr. Bryan is not responsible for that. That breaks the chain. The causal chain is no longer substantial and necessary. It's no longer direct. Likewise, when Mr. Travis McMichael closes the distance from to the left of the truck as you're looking at it on the screen towards the middle of the truck, or exactly where, I'll let y'all figure that out. But when Travis McMichael does that, regardless of whether Travis McMichael is justified in doing so, doesn't that also break the direct causation? Does it not also break the substantial and necessary part of Mr. Bryan in causing the death of Mr. Arbery? I would submit to you that Mr. Bryan cannot be the direct and substantial and necessary cause of Mr. Arbery's death. Whether that is the fault, for lack of a better phrase, of Mr. McMichael, the fault of Mr. Arbery, or the fault of both, or simply without any fault on either part, an unavoidable tragedy. Why should Roddie Bryan be held responsible for that? I would submit to you under the law that Mr. Bryan cannot be guilty of any of the felony murder counts for that reason alone. All right, we're to count 6. Count 6 alleges aggravated assault by shooting. Now, we know that Roddie Bryan did not shoot Mr. Arbery. The theory here is parties to a crime. And again, how can Mr. Bryan intentionally help commit a crime that he has no reason to believe is about to take place? When did Mr. Bryan see the gun? When does Mr. Bryan know they're armed? At what point, at that point, what can Mr. Bryan do about it? Again, you've seen from the video that by the time Mr. Bryan knows that the McMichaels are armed, it's mere seconds before the shooting takes place. So the idea that Mr. Bryan's going to get out of his car or honk or yell, stop, we know that's fantasy on the part of the state. What's going to happen is going to happen at that point. Mr. Bryan cannot be guilty as a part of the crime because he can't intentionally help commit a crime he doesn't have reason to believe is going to take place. And he doesn't help. The McMichaels could have shot Mr. Arbery. Had that been their intention, the McMichaels could have shot Mr. Arbery before he got to Roddie Bryan's driveway. They could have done it the whole time. That's got nothing to do with Roddie Bryan. They don't need Roddie Bryan's help to shoot this young man. And I'm not implying guilt or innocence here. It's not my call. That's your call for the other defendants. But what does that have to do with Mr. Bryan? That takes us back to aggravated assault, count 7. I've discussed the physical evidence with you before, the lack thereof, and I'm going to go through that just as quickly as I can. I would note that the state presented no rebuttal evidence during the trial of the case. And so the evidence is the same as it was when we first had this conversation. I would submit to you that Roddie Bryan isn't out there like Evel Knievel, tearing up his neighbor's yards. How do we know that? First, where are the pictures of the damage done by his truck tires? There's no evidence of that. Second, there's no evidence neighbors complained or reported destruction. Third, there's no evidence of landscaping material or other material on the underside of his truck. How could this be with a deep, perhaps watery drain? I think the evidence was conflicting. Drainage ditch running along much of Burford. Again, the context is key. I believe counsel for one of the McMichaels pointed the same thing out, basically. How hard can it be to evade and elude someone who can't go off-road without doing more damage than the neighbors would allow? There's no evidence from the truck's computer system. Roddie Bryan, again, is either the smartest guy in the room, or I guess he's just the luckiest guy in the world, because when he speaks to Minshew on the scene and later to Lowry, Detective Lowry, that Sunday afternoon, he has no way of knowing whether that information has or will be preserved. Nor is there any evidence that Roddie Bryan tampered with it. Certainly, you can't blame him that law enforcement wait several months to pursue that evidence. There's no evidence that Mr. Bryan deleted or edited the video from 223 either. We know he couldn't, practically speaking. He watched it at the same time as the police officer. Where is the physical evidence on the roadway of Mr. Bryan's aggressive driving? Where are the tire tracks, the brake marks, the skid marks? For all the times Mr. Bryan supposedly has stopped short or changed direction so that he doesn't destroy anything. There's simply no physical evidence of aggressive driving. What about the lumber in the back of the truck? The evidence shows it's still in the back of his truck afterwards. There's no evidence that any of those timbers went through the back of his windshield. No evidence Mr. Bryan had to drive back around the neighborhood picking them up. No evidence of damage to the bed line or the tailgate. I don't believe there's evidence of even a scratch attributed to all the acrobatic maneuvers implied by the state. I'm not sure there's even a picture of the front of Mr. Bryan's truck in evidence, but if there is, I'm sure Ms. Dunikoski will provide it for you. Nobody's been looking for that evidence because there was no crime to investigate. There are no witnesses. Nobody will testify that they saw Mr. Bryan drive aggressively or recklessly. No neighbors will testify to that because it didn't happen. We have a neighborhood chock full of security videos. None of them catch this aggressive driving. What does the medical examiner tell us? The medical examiner testified extensively in this trial. He testified, I believe, that the pickup truck could be a deadly weapon, depending on the manner in which it was used, and that's consistent with the charge this court is going to give you. But what evidence is there that Mr. Bryan did, in fact, injure Mr. Arbery? I don't recall there being any testimony of any physical injuries to Mr. Arbery attributable to Mr. Bryan's actions. The cause of death was gunshot. Let's talk about the fingerprint evidence for a moment. The fingerprint or palm print is at the driver's side door on the side of the pickup truck. Mr. Bryan points this out in the minutes after the shooting to Officer Minshew. There are no prints or cotton fibers on the front of the truck or on the back of the truck. Now, last I checked, unless you're a Hollywood stunt person, maybe a veteran of Fast and Furious, Tokyo Drift, you're not in control unless you're out of control. I think that was the trailer for the movie. Absent something extraordinary like that, we know that pickup trucks don't move sideways. We also know, when I said earlier there was no witness, we have a witness, and that's Travis McMichael. Travis McMichael testified about the events of 2/23/20. Travis McMichael did not testify to aggressive driving on the part of Roddie Bryan. Travis McMichael testified, I believe, to Mr. Arbery attempting to get in Roddie Bryan's vehicle not once but twice. Carjacking is a felony. Attempted carjacking is a felony. You will be charged on what attempt is. But the point here is that the objective evidence is not that Mr. Bryan was engaged in aggressive behavior. The evidence is that Mr. Arbery was. And I don't say that as a measure of disrespect to Mr. Arbery. That's just what the testimony is. And I think the state questioned that. I could be wrong, but I could remind the jury, I believe during the testimony of Special Agent Jason Sechrist, during that testimony, I believe I specifically referenced page 54 of that transcript. There's a time there when Roddie Bryan is testifying, and he says, he's coming back at me, and I'm like, oh, blank, excuse me, again. And I started a kind of evasive action, which we see on the video, and dropped the phone. So, long before Mr. Bryan has any reason to believe that anybody else has seen this, he's provided that information.